The outlaw's gun pressed against Rose Thornton's temple, but her older sister stepped forward, hands trembling. "Take me instead," Beatrice said, her considerable frame blocking the parlour door. "She's young, pretty, worth a ransom. I'm fat, plain, worthless, to everyone except her. Let Rose go and I'll come willingly." The outlaw's scarred face twisted with something that wasn't quite disgust. What he did next would haunt the Arizona Territory for decades. The afternoon sun slanted through the ranch house windows in dusty beams that turned the air golden and thick, but Beatrice Thornton felt nothing resembling warmth as the outlaw pressed his revolver against Rose's temple hard enough to indent the delicate skin. The man was all hard angles and weathered leather, his face marked by a scar that ran from eyebrow to jaw like someone had tried to split him open and failed, and his eyes held the flat darkness of a man who had stopped expecting mercy from the world years ago. Rose whimpered, her pretty face contorted with terror, 19 years old and engaged to the richest man in Tucson, her whole perfect life spreading before her like a promise, and Beatrice felt the familiar weight settle over her shoulders, the weight that had always been there, the knowledge that she was the expendable one, the disappointing daughter, the sister whose value could be measured in what she could sacrifice for those who mattered more. "Take me instead," Beatrice heard herself say, her voice steadier than her trembling hands as she stepped forward, positioning her considerable frame between the outlaw and her sister, blocking the parlour door with the body she had spent 28 years apologising for, the body that father sighed over and suitors ignored, and Rose pretended not to notice when they stood together in town. "She is young, pretty, worth a ransom," Beatrice continued, each word cutting her throat like swallowed glass because they were true, had always been true, the mathematics of her family brutally simple. "I am fat, plain, worthless to everyone except her. Let Rose go and I will come willingly. I will cause no trouble. I will do whatever you require. Just please let my sister live the life I never could." The outlaw's two companions laughed, ugly sounds that bounced off the adobe walls, and one of them, a rail-thin man with tobacco-stained teeth, said something about not wasting a good horse on a cow. Oh, but Beatrice barely heard because she was watching the scarred outlaw's face, watching something shift behind those flat dark eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, or respect, or perhaps just surprise, that anyone would walk toward a gun instead of away from it. The outlaw studied her for a long moment that stretched like hot taffy, his gaze moving across her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held steady, held his stare, and then he did something that would be talked about in the Arizona Territory for decades, something no one who knew his reputation would have predicted. He lowered the gun from Rose's head. "You got more courage than most men I have known," he said, his voice rough as sun-baked earth but not unkind. And then to his men who were protesting loudly about taking the fat one, when they could have the pretty one, he turned with sudden violence and said, "Shut your mouths or ride alone. I make the choices here and I choose her." Rose was screaming now, hysteria climbing her throat, but Beatrice barely heard over the sound of her own heartbeat, over the impossible reality that this hard-eyed outlaw had accepted her offer, had seen something in her selfless act that reached past whatever had calcified his soul, and as he took her arm with surprising gentleness to lead her outside, Beatrice felt the strangest sensation. Not quite fear and not quite relief, but something closer to the first breath after drowning. Stay with me, friends, and comment your city below. I'm sharing this story from Denver, Colorado. Subscribe to my channel and let's see how far our story travels today. Outside the ranch house, the Arizona heat was beginning its evening retreat, the sun dropping toward the distant purple mountains and painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. But the beauty of it was lost on Rose, who had followed them out and was now screaming with a desperation that bordered on madness, her carefully cultivated refinement stripped away to reveal raw animal terror at losing the sister who had raised her after their mother died. And their father remarried, a woman who made clear which daughter was the investment and which was the expense. Beatrice felt Cole's hands on her wrists as he tied them, expected the rope to bite deep enough to cut circulation, expected cruelty because that was what outlaws did in the dime novels father sometimes read aloud. But the bonds were loose, almost ceremonial, tight enough to look legitimate but not tight enough to cause pain, and when he helped her onto the waiting horse, his grip on her waist was steady and careful, supporting her weight without comment or grimace, treating her body with a matter-of-fact respect she had not experienced since childhood. "You will marry Henry Peterson," Beatrice called down to Rose, who was being restrained by their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. "You will live the life I never could, the beautiful life you were meant for, and tell father." "I am sorry." Though even as she said it, Beatrice knew she was not sorry. Not really, because trading her worthless existence for Rose's survival was the first useful thing she had done in years. Cole's men were less accommodating than their Lillard, the thin one called Frank circling the horses with theatrical disgust, while the younger one called Riley made comments about needing a draft horse instead of a saddle mount, about whether the mare could even carry that much weight without breaking, and Beatrice felt the familiar shame crawl up her spine like spiders, the same shame that had lived in her bones since she was 12 and realised she would never be small and delicate like Rose, would never inspire poetry or proposals, would only ever inspire disappointment. Cole's voice cut through the mockery like a blade through silk, sharp and absolute. "Shut your mouths or ride alone," he said without raising his volume, but something in his tone made both men fall silent immediately, made them exchange glances that suggested their leader was acting siege, was breaking some unspoken outlaw code by showing consideration for a hostage, especially one who looked like Beatrice. Cole swung onto his own horse with the easy grace of a man who had spent more time in saddles than beds, took the reins of Beatrice's mount in hand, and as they began riding away from the ranch, Rose's screaming followed them across the desert, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. And Beatrice realised with strange clarity that her sister did not expect to see her again, that no one expected the fat spinster to survive whatever came next. And the terrible truth was that Beatrice did not expect it either, had made her offer fully anticipating death but finding it preferable to watching Rose die, because at least in death she might finally matter, might finally be remembered as the sister who loved enough to sacrifice everything. Cole glanced back at her once as they rode toward the darkening mountains, his scarred face unreadable in the failing light, and Beatrice met his eyes with the resignation of someone who had already made peace with her ending, not knowing that her story was just beginning. They rode hard through the cooling desert, 6 hours that felt like 6 days to Beatrice, whose body was unaccustomed to the demands of horseback travel, every muscle screaming protest as the mare moved beneath her, in a rhythm that jarred her spine and rubbed her thighs raw through the layers of her skirts, but she bit her tongue until she tasted copper, and kept her face composed because she would not give Frank and Riley the satisfaction of hearing her complain, would not confirm their lower opinion of her, would not be weak on top of being worthless. Cole set a brutal pace that had even his men grumbling after the first hour, Frank cursing the heat and the dust and the decision to take a hostage at all, Riley complaining about his saddle and his thirst and the growing darkness that made the desert trail treacherous, but Beatrice noticed that Cole never once looked back to check if she could maintain the speed, simply assumed she would keep up or fall behind, and something about that assumption felt more respectful than coddling would have been, as if he credited her with strength she did not know she possessed. When they finally stopped at a rocky outcrop where a thin stream trickled between stones, Beatrice was shaking with exhaustion and pain, her hands numb from gripping the reins and her legs barely able to support her weight as Cole helped her dismount, but she stood without leaning on him and moved to the stream on legs that threatened to buckle with every step. Frank drank first, then Riley, both men sprawling on the ground with theatrical groans about their suffering, and when Beatrice knelt by the water to cup some in her palms, Frank made a comment about wasting good water on the cow, said it loud enough for everyone to hear, and before Beatrice could even process the familiar sting of such words, Cole had crossed the distance between them, and his fist connected with Frank's nose in a crack that echoed off the rocks like a pistol shot. "She is under my protection now," Cole said as Frank clutched his bleeding face and howled, "Next man who disrespects her answers to me," and the casual violence of it should have terrified Beatrice, but instead she felt something closer to shock because no one had defended her in years, not since Mother died, and she became the burden daughter, the one who required defense but never received it. Cole returned to his saddlebags and produced a canteen, offered it to Beatrice with a gesture that said, "Drink more than the stream provides," and when she hesitated, he added, "Take my bedroll too. The night gets cold and you're not dressed for desert camping," but Beatrice shook her head and said, "I do not deserve extra considerations. I am the hostage. I should take what little I'm given and be grateful for it." Cole studied her in the gathering darkness, stars beginning to pierce the purple sky above them, and the temperature already dropping toward the bone-deep cold that desert nights brought, and his voice when he spoke was quiet but firm. "Let me decide what you deserve," he said, and something in those words, in the way he looked at her, like she was a person capable of deserving rather than an object to be tolerated, made Beatrice's throat tighten with an emotion she could not name, something that felt dangerous and unprecedented and utterly terrifying in its unfamiliarity. They reached the hideout as dawn was breaking across the desert. Morning sun spilling over the rim of a box canyon and turning the red rock walls into sheets of flame, illuminating a cluster of abandoned mining buildings that looked like they had been carved from the stone itself and left to weather into something between structure and ruin. Beatrice had expected a proper outlaw camp with dozens of men and stolen goods piled high, the kind of operation the territorial newspapers described in breathless detail, but what she saw instead was evidence of profound isolation. Just 3 men living in buildings meant to house 50, sparse supplies stacked in corners, gear worn to the point of failure, everything positioned with the defensive paranoia of someone who expected attack from any direction at any moment. Cole dismounted and helped her down, her legs nearly giving out after the brutal overnight ride, and she caught him watching the canyon entrance with the alertness of a man who had learned that survival meant constant vigilance, never quite relaxing even in what passed for home. "This is it," he said without apology or explanation, gesturing to the buildings that clustered around a central area where mining equipment still rusted in the sun. And Beatrice understood without being told that this was not the headquarters of a successful gang, but the desperate refuge of men who had nowhere else to go. Men who had been reduced to this hard-scrabble existence by circumstances she could only guess at. Frank and Riley headed toward one of the larger structures, still grumbling though Frank's voice was nasal now around his broken nose, and Cole took Beatrice's arm and guided her toward a smaller cabin set slightly apart from the others, its door hanging straight and its roof intact unlike some of the more damaged buildings. "You will stay here," Cole said, pushing open the door to reveal a single room with a narrow bed, a chair, a table, and a small stove, sparse but clean, more privacy and comfort than she had expected. "Door locks from inside," he continued, showing her the iron bolt that would slide home and keep the world out. "I give you my word you are safe here. No one will bother you, no one will harm you, you have my protection." Beatrice heard herself laugh, the sound bitter and sharp in the morning stillness. "Safe," she repeated. "I am a hostage. I am a captive. How can you speak of safety when you took me at gunpoint from my home?" Cole turned to face her fully, his scarred face grave in the slanted sunlight, and when he spoke his voice carried absolute conviction. "No," he said. "You are not a hostage. You are a guest who made a trade, who offered herself in exchange for another life. There is a difference between taking and receiving, between forcing and accepting. I did not steal you, Miss Thornton. You gave yourself, and I am bound by honor to respect that sacrifice." The words hung in the desert air between them, and Beatrice found she had no response, because no one had ever suggested her sacrifice deserved honor, that her choice had been anything but the desperate act of a worthless woman with nothing to lose. Alone in the cabin with the door bolted from the inside as Cole had promised, Beatrice sat on the narrow bed and waited for the assault she was certain would come, waited for the door to splinter open and rough hands to prove that his words about safety had been lies, designed to make her compliant. Because that was what men did in the stories she had heard, whispered by married women in town. That was what outlaws were supposed to do with captive women. And yet the hours stretched toward midnight and nothing happened except the sounds of the desert night filtering through gaps in the walls, coyotes singing their lonesome songs and wind stirring the scrub brush and the distant voices of Frank and Riley arguing about something she could not quite hear. She examined the cabin. By moonlight that fell in silver bars across the rough wooden floor noted the provisions stacked neatly on shelves, beans and coffee and hardtack, a bucket of fresh water by the door, blankets that smelled of sun and sage, and tucked in a corner she found a shawl, faded blue with delicate embroidery along the edges, clearly made by a woman's hands for a woman's shoulders, and Beatrice understood with sudden clarity that Cole Branson had lost someone, that this canyon hideout held ghosts she could not see but could feel in the careful way he had prepared this space. Her mind raced through possibilities like a caged animal seeking escape. Father would come with lawmen surely, the territorial marshal would be summoned, poses would be formed, but would they come to rescue her or to recover Rose's sister out of obligation? Would father pay ransom for the daughter who had always been his disappointment, or would he write her off as lost and move forward with Rose's wedding to Henry Peterson, redirecting money he had never wanted to spend on Beatrice's upkeep anyway? She had always been the problem daughter, Large where she should have been delicate, plain where she should have been pretty, 30 pounds heavier than acceptable by the standards of women's magazines that Rose read aloud, while Beatrice pretended not to hear the implied comparisons, unable to attract suitors despite father's half-hearted attempts to find someone desperate enough or charitable enough to take her off his hands. Rose was the investment, the pretty one who would marry well and elevate the family name, while Beatrice was the caretaker who managed the household and raised her sister and accepted her role as the spinster aunt-in-waiting, the woman who would grow old in someone else's home doing someone else's work and be grateful for the roof over her head. She touched her own body in the darkness with the familiar shame that had been her companion since adolescence, hands moving over curves that society deemed excessive, flesh that should not exist in such abundance. And then the shame twisted into something sharper, anger that flared hot in her chest, anger at herself for feeling grateful that Cole had not forced himself on her, for treating basic human decency as if it were a gift rather than the minimum expectation, for being so conditioned to expect cruelty that kindness felt like a miracle. Yet his unexpected honour confused her, disrupted the simple narrative she had built about outlaws and captivity and her own worthlessness, and as sleep finally claimed her, in the small hours before dawn, Beatrice dreamed not of rescue, but of a scarred man's steady gaze treating her like she mattered. Morning came with the smell of coffee, strong and bitter, and Beatrice woke to find Cole standing outside her cabin door with a tin cup in one hand and a plate of hard biscuits in the other, waiting patiently for her to unbolt the door rather than forcing his way in, and when she opened it, he handed her the breakfast without comment about her sleep-rumpled appearance or the way her hair had escaped its pins during the night. "His men are gone," he said in answer to her unspoken question. "Sent them to town for supplies and information. We will not be disturbed." And there was something in the way he said it that suggested privacy was a gift he was offering, a chance to speak without Frank's mockery or Riley's suspicious glances. Beatrice took the coffee and felt its heat through the tin, took a sip that scalded her tongue and tasted like salvation, and then she asked the question that had kept her awake into the small hours. "Why did you not hurt me?" she said, meeting his eyes directly. Because if she was going to die in this canyon, she would at least die knowing the truth. "Why did you treat me with decency when everything I know about outlaws suggests you should have done otherwise?" Cole studied her for a long moment, his scarred face thoughtful in the clean morning light, and when he spoke his words were careful, chosen with precision. "Because you walked into danger for someone you love," he said. "That takes strength of a kind I have rarely seen. Takes courage that most men do not possess, and I do not hurt strong people, Miss Thornton. I only hurt weak cowards who deserve what comes to them, and you are not weak no matter what you have been told." The words struck something deep in Beatrice's chest, something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed, and before she could stop herself she was talking, telling him about a lifetime of being the unfortunate sister, about father's disappointed sighs every time he looked at her, about Rose getting new dresses and music lessons and callers in the parlour while Beatrice got kitchen duty and mending, and the understanding that her role was to serve rather than be served, about growing up knowing she was the wrong daughter, the mistake that kept on requiring food and space and money that could have been better spent elsewhere. Cole listened without interrupting, without offering false sympathy or uncomfortable platitudes, and when she finally fell silent he said something that would echo in her mind for days afterward. "People see what they expect," he said quietly. "They expected weakness because of how you look, because you do not fit their narrow idea of what a woman should be. So they saw weakness, saw something to pity or dismiss, but they were wrong, Miss Thornton. They were profoundly wrong, and their blindness is not your failure." Beatrice felt tears threaten but refused to let them fall, refused to be weak in front of this man who had somehow seen past her size to something she had stopped believing existed, and in that moment standing in the desert morning, with coffee, steam rising between them, she began to understand that maybe Cole Branson's scars went deeper than the one on his face, that maybe he too knew what it meant to be judged for surfaces rather than substance. The afternoon heat pressed down on the canyon like a physical weight, turning the air thick and still, and Cole spread paper and ink on the rough wooden table in the main cabin where he did what passed for planning, maps and wanted posters and ledgers that tracked supplies and money in columns that spoke of careful management rather than reckless outlaw spending. "We need to discuss the ransom," he said without preamble. "I will send a demand to your father, use the money to get to Mexico and start over somewhere the law has not heard my name. But I need you to write the letter. Your words will convince him you are alive and well, will make him more likely to pay quickly without involving every marshal between here and California." Beatrice took the penny offers and stared at the blank paper, trying to imagine what words might convince father to part with money for her sake. And as she began to write, she realised with sinking clarity that she was worth exactly what she had always expected, which was nothing, or close enough to nothing that the distinction hardly mattered. "Cole, sir," she said, setting down the pen after only a few lines. "You should know that my father will pay minimum. If anything, you should not base your plans on receiving substantial ransom because I am not the daughter worth investing in." She explained about Rose's engagement to Henry Peterson, richest man in Tucson, and possibly in all of Arizona territory, about how father had spent every available dollar on Rose's trousseau and debut and wedding preparations, about how the upcoming marriage was meant to elevate the Thornton name and secure their social position, about how Beatrice represented nothing but an expense father had never been able to afford and would likely be relieved to write off entirely. Cole listened to her matter-of-fact delivery, watched her face as she explained her own worthlessness with the same tone she might use to describe the weather, and Beatrice saw something shift in his expression, saw anger there but not directed at her, anger at a father who could value one daughter so highly while dismissing the other so completely. "Then we will ask Peterson," Cole said after a long silence. "Man rich enough to marry your sister can spare some for her saviour, can pay to return the woman who traded her life for his bride. Seems only fair that he should bear the cost." The word saviour hit Beatrice like a fist to the sternum, made her eyes sting with tears she absolutely would not shed, because no one had ever called her that. No one had ever suggested her sacrifice was heroic rather than expected, that her choice to step in front of that gun had been anything other than the obvious move for the expendable sister. She looked at Cole and saw that he meant it, saw that his respect was not performance or manipulation, but genuine recognition of what she had done, and something in her chest that had been locked tight for 28 years began very slowly to crack open. Frank and Riley returned as the sun was setting, their horses lathered and their faces grim with news that clearly weighed heavy, and they unloaded supplies with unusual urgency while casting glances at Cole that suggested whatever they had learned in town had spooked them badly. "We got a problem," Frank said once the horses were tended, and the three men gathered by the fire. "Bigger problem than we thought. There is a U.S. Marshal asking questions in Tucson, fellow named Jack Thornton, no relation to her, but still, and he is hunting you specific Cole, got your name and description, and seems to think you robbed the Tucson Bank and Trust back in March." Cole's face went still in the way Beatrice was learning meant he was controlling rage, and his voice when he spoke was dangerously quiet. "I did not rob that bank," he said. "Miguel robbed that bank and left evidence pointing to me, framed me clean while I was 3 counties away buying cattle, but no one cares about truth when they have a convenient suspect." Riley shifted uncomfortably and added the worst news. "Miguel is looking for you too. Got word he has been asking around about canyon hideouts, about old mining camps. Seems he wants to eliminate the only witness who can prove he set you up once you're dead before you can tell your side to anyone who might listen." Frank and Riley exchanged glances that spoke of decisions already made between them, and Frank said what they were both thinking. "We need to cut losses and run to Mexico immediately, tonight if possible, get across the border before either the law or Miguel catches up to us." Riley nodded agreement and then asked the question that made Beatrice's stomach clench. "And the woman? What do we do with her? Leave her here with supplies and directions back to town. She will slow us down and we need to move fast." Cole's response was immediate and absolute. "She stays under protection until ransom comes or I deliver her safely myself. She traded her life for her sister and I gave my word she would be safe. I do not break my word regardless of what convenience suggests." Frank laughed, a sound without humour. "You have gone soft, boss. Keeping her around like she is something precious? Are you keeping her for yourself because she ain't worth the trouble? She ain't worth nothing to nobody, and we all know." Cole's gun cleared leather before Frank could finish the sentence. The movement so fast it seemed to teleport from holster to hand, and the barrel was pressed against Frank's forehead, while Cole's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Leave now, or stay and shut your mouths, choose. But if you stay you will show respect or you will answer to me in ways you will not enjoy." Frank went pale around his still healing broken nose. Riley raised his hands in placating gesture, and both men nodded agreement, though Beatrice could see the resentment festering in their eyes, could feel the tension thickening the air like smoke. Cole holstered his gun, but the damage was done. The camp now divided between a leader whose protection of his hostage made no sense to men who saw the world through simpler calculations, and Beatrice understood that she had become not just a hostage but a liability, not just a problem but the problem, and worse, that Cole was risking everything to keep his word to a woman he had every practical reason to abandon. Beatrice heard every word of the argument through the thin cabin walls, heard Frank's cruel assessment of her worth and Riley's practical suggestion to abandon her, heard most importantly Cole's absolute refusal to break his word regardless of the danger it brought him, and the knowledge sat heavy in her chest through the long evening until finally she could bear it no longer, and called his name through the locked door. "Cole," she said, "I need to speak with you." And she heard his boots on the hard-packed earth outside, heard him stop just beyond the threshold, respecting even now her privacy and safety. "Let me go," Beatrice said through the wood that separated them. "I will walk back to the ranch, tell them you rode south toward Mexico. Your men are right. I am slowing you down and putting you in danger. You have a U.S. Marshal hunting you and a former partner who wants you dead, and keeping me here makes you vulnerable in ways you cannot afford." Cole's response came swift and stunned her with its vehemence. "You think I would let a woman walk alone through desert and Apache territory? Let you try to cover 7 miles of country that kills strong men on horseback? What kind of man do you think I am, Miss Thornton?" "An outlaw," Beatrice said, the word feeling strange in her mouth because it no longer seemed to fit the man she had come to know in these few days. A killer, probably. A man who lives outside the law and makes choices based on survival rather than sentiment. Maybe, Cole admitted, and his honesty was somehow more reassuring than denial would have been. Maybe I am those things. Maybe I have killed and stolen and done things that would make you recoil if you knew the details, but I keep my word. I said you would be safe, and that means delivering you home alive, or keeping you alive until that is possible. It does not mean abandoning you to die, because it would be convenient for my escape." Beatrice pressed her palm against the door and imagined she could feel the heat of him on the other side, imagined the scarred face she was learning to read, the eyes that looked at her like she mattered. "Why did you become an outlaw?" she asked. "What happened to make you choose this life?" Cole was silent for so long she thought he would not answer, and when he finally spoke his voice had gone hard with old pain. "That is a longer story for a longer night, Miss Thornton. A story that requires trust. I am not sure either of us is ready to give, but know this, I did not choose this life so much as it chose me. Sometimes the world decides what you are, and you can either accept it or die fighting it, and I am not ready to die." The desert night surrounded them with its sounds, coyotes and wind and the whisper of sand against stone. 2 people separated by the wood and history, and the vast gulf between outlaw and captive, and yet Beatrice felt something building between them, something that might in time become trust, might become the foundation for understanding how a hard man could show unexpected honor and how a woman who thought herself worthless might begin to see herself through eyes that recognized value she had stopped believing existed. As days passed, waiting for the response to the ransom letter, unexpected routines developed in the canyon camp, small domestic patterns that made the waiting feel less like captivity and more like something Beatrice could not quite name but recognized in the ease of repetition and shared tasks. She took over cooking after watching Riley burn beans 3 days running, announcing that she was good at it, and their men were terrible, and though Frank grumbled about taking orders from a woman, his complaints died when he tasted her first meal. Rabbit stew stretched with wild onions and herbs she found growing near the spring. Biscuits that were actually tender instead of the rocks they had been choking down for months. Even Frank admitted grudgingly that she was useful, and Riley began bringing her whatever game he shot with something approaching gratitude in his eyes. And Beatrice felt the unfamiliar satisfaction of being valued for her competence rather than tolerated despite her inadequacy. Cole helped with the heavy water carrying without being asked, appearing each morning to haul buckets from the spring before she could attempt it herself. And when she protested that she could manage, he simply said she should not have to manage everything alone, and continued doing it regardless of her objections. She mended his shirts in the evenings, sitting by firelight with needle and thread, and could not help noticing the bullet holes and knife cuts in the fabric. Evidence of a life lived violently, evidence of near misses and luck running thin, and her hands trembled slightly as she stitched over the places where he had almost died. He taught her to shoot on the 5th day, setting up targets against the canyon wall and placing his revolver in her hands, his body warm behind hers as he adjusted her stance and steadied her grip, and spoke quietly about breathing and trigger pull, and not flinching when the shot came. "You should know how to protect yourself," he said. "The world is dangerous, and you will not always have someone watching over you. and Beatrice heard herself respond before she could stop the words. "I have never had anyone watching over me," she said. "Not since Mother died. Not since I became the burden daughter. I have been the one who watches over others, but no one has ever watched over me." Cole's hands tightened briefly on her shoulders, and his voice when he spoke was quiet but absolutely firm. "You do now," he said, and the simple declaration hit her harder than any grand romantic speech could have. Hit her in the vulnerable place she had armoured over with resignation and self-deprecation, and when she fired the gun, her hands were shaking, not from fear of the weapon, but from the terrifying intimacy of being cared for by a man who asked nothing in return, except that she let him offer what he could. Desert days blurred together, in a rhythm of simple tasks that became something more than their component parts, became intimacy built in ordinary moments, competence building attraction so gradually, neither quite noticed it happening, care becoming habit until neither could remember what it felt like to move through days without the other's presence making everything somehow more bearable. The next morning Cole appeared at her cabin and said he wanted to show her something, the most beautiful spot for miles, and despite her confusion about why an outlaw would care about beauty or want to share it with his hostage, Beatrice followed him deeper into the canyon, where the walls narrowed and the path climbed steadily upward over rocks that required careful footing. She was breathless within minutes, her body unaccustomed to such exertion, her lungs labouring in the thin desert air, and shame crawled up her spine, because surely Cole could hear her struggle, could see how pathetic she was. But when she glanced at him, he was simply waiting patiently at each difficult section, offering his hand to help her over the rough spots without comment or judgment, treating her breathlessness as natural rather than evidence of weakness. They emerged into a hidden pocket where water flowed from a crack in the rock, creating a spring that fed a pool surrounded by cottonwood trees, impossibly green in the Arizona desert, a sanctuary of shade and water and birdsong that felt like stepping into another world entirely. "This is where I come when the canyon feels too small," Cole said, settling on a flat rock by the water, "when I need to remember there is more to life than running and hiding." And Beatrice sat beside him and listened to the water, and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since the guns had appeared at her ranch. Cole began talking without preamble, his voice steady as he told her about being a ranch hand who saved every penny for years, about finally having enough to buy land and start his own operation, about trusting a partner named Miguel who seemed honest and capable, about how Miguel had stolen everything, the money and the land deed and Cole's good name, had robbed a bank and arranged evidence so thoroughly that when lawmen came looking they found Cole's hat and his description and witness statements that Miguel had carefully constructed. "Worse was what came after," Cole continued. "I had a fiancée, Elizabeth, woman I loved enough to build a future for, and when the accusations came she believed them, believed I was capable of theft and betrayal, married Miguel 3 months later, and I learned later it had been planned all along that Miguel had wanted her and had destroyed me to claim her. That shawl you found in the cabin was hers, forgot it when she left, and I keep it not from sentiment but as a reminder never to trust anyone that completely again." Beatrice felt the tears threaten because she understood that kind of betrayal, understood what it meant to be found insufficient by people who should have valued you, and she found herself telling him about her own history, about mother dying when she was 10 and father remarrying a woman who made clear from the first day that Beatrice was a burden rather than a blessing, about how Rose was born pretty and delicate while Beatrice was born hungry, as her stepmother put it, about learning early that she was the wrong daughter, the mistake that kept consuming resources that should have gone to the perfect child. They sat by the water, surrounded by the impossible green of cottonwoods, and let their stories settle between them like stones, and Beatrice realized they both knew the particular pain of being rejected by people who should have protected them. Both knew what it meant to be judged and found wanting through no fault of their own, except the fault of existing wrong. Miguel's men arrived at midday when the sun was highest and shadows shortest, 3 riders appearing at the canyon entrance with rifles already drawn, and Cole's shout of warning sent everyone scrambling for cover as the first shots cracked across the camp and sent rock chips flying from the canyon walls. Beatrice ran for her cabin as ordered, bolted the door and crouched behind the bed with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, but through the gaps in the walls she could see the fight unfolding, could see Riley take a bullet to his leg that sent him crashing to the ground behind a water trough, could see Frank pinned down behind the supply wagon with no clear shot and no way to help his fallen companion, could see Cole returning fire from behind the main cabin, but unable to advance without exposing himself to the crossfire. She moved without thinking, grabbed the rifle Cole had taught her to use and unbolted the door and emerged into the chaos of gun smoke and shouting, and one of Miguel's men turned toward her with surprise clear on his face because apparently hostages were not supposed to fight back, and Beatrice remembered everything Cole had taught her about breathing and aim and not flinching, remembered the way his hands had steadied hers and his voice had told her she was capable, and she fired. The shot took the man in the shoulder and spun him around, not a killing blow, but enough to make him drop his rifle and stumble backward, clutching the wound, enough to break the attacker's advantage and allow Cole to advance, and within minutes the three men were fleeing back down the canyon trail, leaving blood spots on the rocks behind them. Cole reached her in 3 strides, his face twisted with fury and terror in equal measure. "You could have been killed," he shouted. "What were you thinking coming out here? I told you to stay hidden to stay safe," Beatrice shouted right back, her own fear transmuting to anger. "So could you? You were outnumbered and Riley was down and Frank could not help. I protected you because you have protected me. That is how partnerships work." "This is not a partnership," Cole argued, but his voice had lost its conviction. Beatrice met his eyes directly. "Is it not?" she challenged. "Because it feels like partnership to me. Feels like 2 people keeping each other alive, which seems the very definition of the word." Riley's groan from the ground cut through their argument, and Beatrice pushed past Cole to kneel beside the wounded man, her hands already assessing the damage with a competence that made both Cole and Frank stare. "I help Dr. Morrison in Tucson frequently," she explained as she worked. "He let me assist with everything from setting bones to extracting bullets. Said I had steadier hands than most men he knew. And Riley, you are lucky because the bullet went clean through and missed the bone, but you will need this wound cleaned and stitched and watched for infection through the night." She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, cleaning and stitching Riley's leg with supplies from the camp's medical kit, and Cole watched her hands move with practiced efficiency and felt something shift in his chest, felt his feelings for her deepen into territory that was dangerous for an outlaw who had sworn never to care for anyone again, and when Frank quietly said she saved his life, saved all our lives really, Cole could only nod because the words felt too large and too terrifying to speak aloud. After tending Riley through the long afternoon and into evening, Beatrice found herself walking to the spring in darkness, her body exhausted but her mind too restless for sleep, her hands still shaking slightly from the violence she'd participated in, and the life she'd helped save. And she sat on the flat rock where she and Cole had shared their stories and tried to make sense of who she was becoming in this canyon, this woman who shot men and stitched wounds and argued with outlaws about the definition of partnership. Cole found her there in the moonlight, his boots scraping on stone the only warning before he settled beside her with careful distance between them. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for Riley, for risking yourself, for everything you did today. You saved his life and probably ours as well." Beatrice turned to face him and her voice came out fiercer than intended. "I am not fragile," she said. "Everyone has always assumed I was. Because of my size, people think fat equals weak or helpless. They think a large woman must be soft in all ways, must need protecting and coddling. But I am neither weak nor helpless. I am tired of being treated like I might break." Cole studied her face in the moonlight and his response was immediate and absolute. "I never thought you were weak," he said. "From the moment you stepped in front of that gun for your sister, I knew you were the strongest person in that room. Knew you had courage that most men spend their whole lives wishing they possessed. And everything since has only confirmed it." Beatrice felt tears begin to fall, could not stop them. Though she tried, because no one had ever called her strong, no one had ever looked at her body and seen anything but failure or disappointment, and Cole continued speaking through her tears, as if they were not something to be ashamed of, but simply evidence of feeling deeply. "I have been thinking about the ransom," he said. "Your father responded to our letter. He is paying the amount we requested. But he wrote something that made me want to ride back to Tucson and shoot him where he stands." Cole produced the letter from his pocket, and Beatrice read by moonlight, read father's careful script noting that he would pay for the plain one, though she was no great loss, that propriety demanded he make the effort, but the amount should reflect her actual value to the family, which was minimal at best, that he hoped this unfortunate incident would not damage Rose's upcoming marriage to Henry Peterson. The humiliation was total and complete. Was every fear Beatrice had carried confirmed in father's own handwriting, and she felt something inside her crack open and bleed. But Cole's hand covered hers, and his voice was rough with barely controlled rage. "You deserve better than people who cannot see what is right in front of them," he said. "Deserve better than a father who measures worth in pounds and prettiness instead of courage and character. And I swear to you, Beatrice, that as long as you are under my protection, no one will treat you as less than you are ever again." Marshal Jack Thornton arrived at the Thornton Ranch 10 days after the abduction. A tall man with iron-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. Wearing the star of United States Marshal with the weariness of someone who had seen too much of human nature and found most of it wanting. And he listened to Rose's account of the raid with careful attention that suggested he was hearing more than just her words. He was almost gentle with Beatrice, Rose said, her voice trembling with guilt that had been building since she watched her sister ride away. He did not hurt her, did not treat her cruelly. He looked at her like, I do not know how to explain it, like she mattered, like she was a person worth considering instead of just a means to an end. Father interrupted with the dismissive wave he always used when Beatrice was discussed. The outlaw is fooling her, he said firmly. Beatrice is naive, always has been. She reads too many books and thinks the world is kinder than it is. The man is simply smart enough to keep his hostage compliant by treating her gently. It means nothing about his true character. Rose turned on Father with sudden fury that shocked everyone in the room, including herself. Beatrice is not naive, she said, her voice rising. She is the smartest one in this family, smarter than you or me or anyone else under this roof. She simply has the misfortune of being smart in a body you decided was wrong, and you never noticed her intelligence because you were too busy being disappointed in her appearance. Father's face reddened, but Rose was not finished, was finally giving voice to years of watching her sister diminished. She gave up everything for me, Rose continued, stepped in front of a gun meant for my head, offered herself knowing full well what might happen to her, and I will not dishonour that sacrifice by pretending she is foolish or weak, and furthermore, I will not marry Henry Peterson until Beatrice returns safely. She can wait for her wedding, so I can wait for mine. Marshal Thornton watched this exchange with interest that went beyond professional curiosity, noted the father who spoke of his daughter with casual dismissal, noted the younger sister whose guilt was transforming into fierce protectiveness, noted the family dynamics that suggested Beatrice Thornton had never been valued by the people who should have treasured her most. You said the outlaw looked at her like she mattered, the Marshal said to Rose. Can you explain what you mean by that? Rose thought for a moment, then nodded. My father looks at Beatrice like she is a burden. Henry Peterson looks at me like I'm a possession. But this outlaw Cole Branson looked at my sister like she was a person, like her thoughts and feelings and choices mattered, and that is something she has never received from anyone in Tucson. Marshal Thornton made notes in his leather journal, and thought about Cole Branson, who had a reputation for violence, but apparently also for unexpected honour. And he wondered if perhaps this case was more complicated than a simple kidnapping, wondered if maybe Beatrice Thornton was safer with the outlaw than she had ever been in her father's house. Frank made his move at dawn when Cole was checking the canyon perimeter for signs that Miguel's men might return, when Riley was still sleeping off the laudanum Beatrice had given him for pain, when the camp was quiet and Beatrice was alone filling water buckets at the spring, and she did not hear him approach until his hand clamped over her mouth and his arm went around her waist, dragging her backward toward where horses were saddled and waiting. Riley heard the struggle and dragged himself from his bedroll despite his wounded leg, tried to stop Frank with words first and then with his body, but Frank was healthy and motivated by greed, and he shoved Riley hard enough to send the injured man sprawling with a cry of pain that Frank ignored entirely. Beatrice fought with unexpected ferocity, had spent her entire life being underestimated because of her size, and she used that now, went for Frank's, eyes with her nails like Cole had taught her when they practiced defensive tactics, drove her knee toward his groin with all the force she could muster, and for a moment, Frank's grip loosened enough that she thought she might break free, but then his fist connected with her face and she tasted blood as her lips split open against her teeth and the world tilted sideways. "You are coming with me to Miguel," Frank snarled as he dragged her by her hair toward the horses. "Going to get me a real reward instead of waiting on your worthless father's pittance. Miguel pays good for information, and he will pay better for Cole's woman." And Beatrice tried to scream, but Frank's hand was back over her mouth, and she could only struggle uselessly as he lifted her toward a saddle. Cole appeared like vengeance made flesh, came running from the canyon entrance with his face transformed into something terrible and primally violent, and what followed was brutal in ways that Beatrice had never witnessed. Cole's fists driving into Frank's face and body with methodical fury, each blow accompanied by words spoken in a voice that barely sounded human. "You put hands on her," Cole said between strikes, "under my protection. In my camp, you violated every code that makes us different from animals." And Frank tried to fight back, but Cole was beyond reason, was pure protective rage channeled through muscle and bone until Frank lay broken and bleeding in the dust. Cole hauled Frank to his feet, shoved him toward his horse, and spoke words that carried across the canyon like prophecy. "Tell Miguel I am coming for him. Tell the law I did not rob that bank. Tell everyone that Cole Branson keeps his word and protects what is his. Now ride before I change my mind about letting you live." Frank rode out holding his shattered face, and Cole turned to Beatrice with hands still bloody and asked in a voice gone suddenly gentle if she was hurt. And Beatrice touched her split lip and said she was fine, but she was not fine, was shaking with shock and adrenaline and the terrifying realization that this man would kill for her without hesitation, that his violence was not random or cruel but channeled entirely toward protecting those he deemed worthy of protection. And she understood finally that Cole Branson was dangerous, but his danger was hers to command. Cole brought her to the cabin and tended her split lip and bruised face with shocking gentleness, his large hand shaking as he dabbed at the blood with a wet cloth. And Beatrice could see that rage was still coursing through him, could see in the tension of his jaw and the wildness in his eyes that he was fighting for control over instincts that wanted nothing more than to chase Frank down and finish what he had started. "I should have killed him," Cole said, his voice raw, "should have put a bullet in his skull for putting hands on you, for daring to hurt you under my protection." "But you did not," Beatrice said quietly, "because you are not what they say you are. You are not a mindless killer or a man without conscience." Cole's hand stilled and he met her eyes with something like desperation. "I'm exactly what they say," he said. "I have killed men. Beatrice, more than one. I've stolen and hurt people and lived by the gun for 3 years. I'm not some misunderstood hero waiting for redemption. I am an outlaw who has done outlaw things, and there is blood on my hands that will never wash clean." Beatrice reached up and touched the scar on his face, traced it from eyebrow to jaw with fingers that trembled slightly. And her voice when she spoke carried absolute conviction. "What happened to you was not fair," she said. "What Miguel did, what Elizabeth did, the way the world judged you and found you guilty without trial, none of that was fair. And what you became because of it does not erase who you were before or who you could be again if given the chance." Cole pulled back as if her touch burned him. "Do not make me into something I am not," he said. "Do not imagine I am redeemable or salvageable. Do not project onto me some fantasy of the good man beneath the violence, because that man died 3 years ago and what is left is not worth saving." Beatrice met his eyes and whispered 2 words that would change everything between them. "Too late," she said. "I have already seen it. Have seen the man who keeps his word and protects the weak and tends wounds with gentle hands. Have seen the honor that lives beneath the scars and the violence. And you cannot convince me I'm wrong no matter how hard you try." Cole kissed her, then with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness and isolation, kissed her with careful attention to her injured lip, poured into that kiss everything he could not say with words, and Beatrice kissed him back with equal fervour, despite this being her first real kiss at 28 years old, despite having no experience with passion or desire, or the way a man's hands could cradle a woman's face like she was something precious beyond measure. The kiss was worth the wait, was worth every lonely year, and every moment of thinking herself unlovable, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the soft morning light filtering through the cabin walls illuminated 2 people who had finally stopped pretending this was captivity, and admitted without words that something profound and unexpected had grown between them in this canyon hideout, where an outlaw and his hostage had somehow become something neither had planned but both desperately needed. Morning brought awkwardness that settled over the camp like fog, and Beatrice emerged from her cabin to find Riley, sitting by the fire with his wounded leg propped up, watching her with eyes that held far too much knowledge and something that might have been approval, and when Cole appeared from checking the horses, he tried to maintain the careful distance they had observed before the kiss, but failed spectacularly, his gaze, drawn to her like iron to lodestone, his body angling toward hers despite his obvious attempts to remain professionally detached. Beatrice faced her own spiralling fears as she prepared breakfast with hands that remembered the feel of his face, reminded herself that this was temporary, that the ransom would come eventually and Cole would take her home, and this strange intimacy would end, that she was nothing but a placeholder in his life, a momentary softness in a hard existence that once she was gone he would return to his outlaw ways and forget the fat woman who had briefly occupied his canyon and his thoughts. Cole's thoughts ran parallel paths of self-recrimination, telling himself that Beatrice deserved better than an outlaw with a price on his head, that she should return to civilization and find a good man who could give her the stable, respectable life she had been denied, that he had no right to want her when all he could offer was running and hiding and the constant threat of violence. But at breakfast their hands touched, reaching for the coffee pot at the same moment, and the electricity that sparked between them was undeniable, was visible to anyone watching, and they both jerked back as if burned while Riley made a sound that was half laugh and half exasperation. "You two going to keep pretending?" Riley asked bluntly. "Or admit this is more than a hostage situation? Because I may be wounded, but I am not blind, and what I see is two people dancing around feelings that are obvious to everyone except apparently themselves." Cole turned on him with warning in his voice. "Riley, you should rest. Save your strength for healing." "Frank was wrong about a lot," Riley continued, ignoring the warning. "But he was right that you have changed, boss. She has changed you. Made you remember there is more to life than survival and revenge, and the question is what you're going to do about it. Are you going to keep pretending this is just business, or are you going to admit that somewhere between the abduction and now you fell in love with your hostage?" The word love hung in the desert morning air like a challenge, and Beatrice felt her heart stutter because surely Riley was wrong. Surely what existed between them was gratitude and proximity, and the strange intimacy of shared danger. But when she looked at Cole and saw the way he was looking at her, saw the hunger and tenderness and fear warring in his expression, she understood that Riley had simply spoken the truth that neither of them had been brave enough to voice, and the future that had seemed so certain in its temporary nature suddenly became terrifyingly uncertain in all the ways that mattered most. Word came through Riley's contact in town, a Mexican stable hand who owed Riley a favour and could move between worlds without attracting attention, that father was bringing the ransom money to a neutral meeting point, an abandoned Spanish mission 3 days' ride northeast, and that Marshal Jack Thornton would accompany him as standard procedure for such exchanges, which meant Cole would need to plan carefully to avoid arrest while completing the transaction. Cole spread maps across the table and plotted routes and escape paths with the methodical precision of a man who had stayed alive this long by thinking 3 steps ahead, and Beatrice watched him plan their separation with growing dread that she tried desperately to hide, because what right did she have to mourn the ending of something that should never have begun? "Don't take the money," Beatrice said suddenly, surprising herself with the words, "Let me go free and escape to Mexico clean. You will move faster alone and the money will only slow you down and tie you to this place." Cole's response was immediate and sharp. "That money is your worth to them," he said. "Every cent they begrudge, paying for the daughter they never valued, and I am taking it all to remind them what they undervalued, to make them pay in the only language men like your father understand." His anger on her behalf should not have warmed her to her, but it did. Warmed her even as she recognized that the ransom exchange meant the end of these strange suspended days, where she had felt seen and valued and protected for the first time in her adult life, meant returning to a world that had already decided she was worthless and would not change its assessment regardless of what she had survived or who she had become. Cole bent over his maps and refused to meet her eyes, and Beatrice understood that he too was feeling the approaching loss, was planning their goodbye with the same careful attention he gave to planning escape routes. But neither of them voiced the pain, because as speaking it aloud would make it real in ways they could not bear. Riley spoke up from his chair where he was slowly regaining strength. "I will ride with you," he said. "You will need protection, and I owe you both. You kept me alive, Miss Beatrice, when I would have bled out, and you, boss, have been more than an employer, have been the closest thing to family I've known." His wounded leg would slow them down, and all 3 knew it. But Cole simply nodded acceptance because loyalty mattered more than convenience, because Riley's offer came from the same code that made Cole refuse to break his word regardless of cost. They spent the evening planning, studying maps, checking weapons, preparing supplies for 3 days' travel, and the practical details created a framework that kept them from discussing what came after the exchange, kept them from acknowledging that in 3 days Beatrice would return to her father's house and Cole would ride to Mexico, and whatever existed between them would end as abruptly as it had begun, unfinished and impossible and achingly real. 3 days riding through Arizona desert passed too quickly and too slowly, each mile bringing them closer to the mission and the inevitable separation. And Riley rode ahead as scout, giving Cole and Beatrice time, a loan that felt both precious and torturous, time they filled with conversations that ranged across everything they had never said, childhoods and dreams and regrets spilling out like water from cracked vessels that could no longer contain what they held. Cole revealed he had wanted a ranch once, wanted family and simple life, wanted to build something that mattered and would last beyond his own years, wanted to look at land he owned and know he had created something good from the violence and chaos the world had handed him. Beatrice shared her own dream, which was simpler and somehow more impossible, that she had wanted just once to feel valued, wanted someone to look at her and see something worthwhile, not the fat sister or the disappointing daughter or the burden that consumed resources better spent elsewhere. Just her, just Beatrice, seen and recognised as having worth beyond her utility or her failures. On the second day, Cole stopped his horse and turned to look at her directly, his scarred face serious in the afternoon light, and his words when they came carried the weight of absolute truth. "I see you, Beatrice," he said, "every part of you. The strength and the courage and the kindness and the sharp mind that solves problems others cannot see, and all of it is worthwhile. All of it matters, and anyone who cannot see that is blind in ways that have nothing to do with their eyes." Beatrice felt tears threaten and forced herself to ask the question she had been avoiding for 3 days. "What happens after the exchange?" she said. "What happens when you give me to my father and take your money and ride away?" Cole's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the horizon. "You go home," he said. "You live your life. You find a good man who can give you stability and respect and everything you deserve." "What if I do not want that life?" Beatrice said. "What if I want something else, want someone else?" "You have to want it," Cole said, roughly, "because I have nothing to offer you but running and hiding, but looking over my shoulder for the rest of however long that is, but danger and uncertainty and a life that could end with a bullet or a noose any day." "What if that is enough?" Beatrice whispered. "What if I would rather have 1 year of being seen and valued by you than 50 years of being tolerated by someone respectable?" Cole turned back to her, and she saw everything in his face, love and longing, and the terrible certainty that he could not ask her to choose his life, could not be selfish enough to claim her when he had nothing to give, and whatever he might have said was interrupted by Riley's warning whistle, sharp and urgent from ahead, and they both understood their time for talking was over because they were approaching the mission, where decisions would be made and futures would be determined, and the desert sunset painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, like the world itself was mourning what they were about to lose. They arrived at the abandoned Spanish mission as dawn was breaking, the crumbling adobe walls glowing pink in the early light, and Father was already there with Marshal Thornton and an unexpected addition. Rose, who stood beside Father with her face showing equal parts guilt and fierce love for the sister she had watched ride away 3 weeks ago. The meeting was tense from the first moment, Father barely glancing at Beatrice before turning his attention to Cole and the weapons both sides carried, more concerned with maintaining propriety and completing the transaction quickly than with assessing whether his daughter had been harmed or traumatized by her ordeal. Marshal Thornton proved more interested in the human elements, his keen eyes moving between Cole and Beatrice with the assessment of a man trained to read situations beyond their surface appearance. "Miss Thornton," the Marshal asked directly, "were you harmed during your captivity? Did the man or his associates hurt you in any way?" Beatrice answered with absolute honesty, aware that her words might determine Cole's fate. "No," she said clearly. "I was treated with respect and care. I was given my own locked quarters. I was fed and protected. I was taught skills I did not possess and valued in ways I have never experienced. I was not harmed." Father made a sound of disgust and snapped at her. "Do not defend him, Beatrice. He is a criminal regardless of how he treated you. You are making this situation worse by suggesting there was anything honourable in his actions." Cole's voice cut across the mission courtyard cold as winter wind. "Criminal who protected your daughter while you wrote that she was no great loss," he said. "Criminal who kept her safe and fed and respected while you could not manage to value her enough to pay ransom without complaining about the expense. I have met murderers with more paternal feeling than you display." Father's face turned crimson with rage and humiliation that his private words had been shared, and Rose gasped as she realized what Father must have written in his response to the ransom demand, realized that even faced with Beatrice's potential death, Father could not manage to pretend she mattered. Marshal Thornton watched this exchange with growing interest, and Beatrice saw his respect for Cole increase slightly, as he recognized that honor could exist even in outlaws, that sometimes the criminals held more decency than the respectable citizens who condemned them. The money was produced and counted, the transaction completed with efficiency that felt brutal in its finality, and through it all Rose watched Beatrice's face and saw what others might have missed, saw the way her sister's eyes followed Cole's every movement, saw the careful way they avoided touching each other, as if contact would break whatever control they were maintaining, saw the pain that flickered across Beatrice's features when Father gestured impatiently for her to come stand with the family, and Rose understood with sudden, devastating clarity that her sister had fallen in love with her captor and was now being forced to choose between the life she'd always known and the man who had finally made her feel alive. 22. Miguel's ambush. Scene: mission, violence erupts. The emotional reunion is shattered when Miguel and 6 men surround the mission. He's been tracking Cole, waited for the ransom exchange. "I'll take the money, the girl as leverage, and eliminate my only witness," Miguel announces. He's cold, cruel, everything Cole is not. Marshal Thornton draws weapon. "I'm federal law. Stand down." Miguel laughs. "Law doesn't mean much out here, Marshal." Shootout erupts. Cole, Riley, and surprisingly Marshal Thornton fight side by side against Miguel's men. Father grabs money and tries to flee, proving his cowardice. Beatrice and Rose hide behind mission altar. One of Miguel's men drags Beatrice out as hostage. Cole sees her in danger and does something that will cost him, abandons cover, exposing himself to multiple gunmen to reach her. He's shot in the shoulder but kills her captor. Riley takes bullet meant for Marshall. Miguel escapes in chaos but without money or Cole's death. Gunsmoke, blood, alliances forged in fire, Cole's love proven through sacrifice. Rose pulled Beatrice aside before Father could claim her, dragged her behind the mission wall where crumbling adobe provided privacy, and spoke the truth that hung between them like smoke. "You love him," Rose said. Not a question but a statement of observed fact, and Beatrice found she could not deny it, could not summon the lie that would make this easier. "It does not matter," Beatrice said instead. "I am coming home, I am doing what is expected, what is proper, what Father demands." Rose's response was fierce and unexpected. "Why?" she said. "Why are you coming home to marry some merchant Father Pix who needs a housekeeper, to spend the rest of your life being invisible in someone else's house, doing someone else's work, Beatrice? For once in your life, choose yourself, choose what you want instead of what others accept." "He is an outlaw," Rose protested weakly. "There is no future there, no stability, no respectability, nothing but running and danger and the constant threat of violence." Rose gripped her sister's shoulders hard enough to leave marks. "There is no future at home either," she said. "Father will marry you off to someone who needs domestic help, someone who will treat you like furniture, who will use you and ignore you and never see the extraordinary woman you are. At least Cole Branson looks at you like you are the sunrise. At least he sees you and values you and would die to protect you. Is that not worth more than all the respectability in the world?" Beatrice began crying, tears falling hot and fast down her cheeks. "I am scared, Rose," she admitted. "What if I choose him and he realizes I am not worth the trouble? What if the feelings he has now fade when he sees me every day? What if I am temporary softness in his hard life, and once we are away from this crisis, he remembers I am fat and plain and worthless?" Rose gripped Beatrice's hands with desperate strength. "What if you do not choose him and spend your entire life regretting it?" she said. "What if you let fear steal the one chance you have at real happiness? What if you go home and marry whoever Father picks and spend 50 years wondering what might have been if you had been brave enough to choose love over safety?" Rose's voice broke. "You saved me, Beatrice. You stepped in front of a gun for me. You gave yourself to an outlaw to keep me safe, and I have carried that guilt every single day since you rode away. Now I am telling you to save yourself, to step toward the life you want instead of away from the life you fear. And if that means becoming an outlaw's woman, then do it. Do it and never look back, because you deserve to be loved the way that man loves you. And I will not let you sacrifice yourself again for propriety or Father's comfort or anyone's expectations except your own." Both Cole and Riley were wounded, blood soaking through shirts and dripping onto the mission's ancient stones, evidence of the violence that had erupted when Miguel's men ambushed the exchange, and Marshal Thornton, rather than moving to arrest Cole as his duty demanded, was helping to tend wounds with practiced efficiency that spoke of battlefield experience. "You saved my life and theirs," the Marshal said as he bound Riley's shoulder where a bullet had torn through muscle. "I owe you a chance to explain your side of that bank robbery everyone says you committed." Cole told the truth through gritted teeth while Beatrice worked on his bullet wound in his shoulder, told about Miguel's betrayal and the careful way he had been framed, about the evidence planted and the witnesses paid, about losing everything, including the woman he had planned to marry. And Marshal Thornton listened with the careful attention of a man who had learned that official stories and true stories were not always the same thing. "I will investigate," the Marshal said finally. "But Cole, You have still broken laws since then, have stolen and threatened and lived outside society's rules, and the best I can offer is time to run before I have to chase, take your woman and disappear before my duty catches up to my conscience." Father had revealed himself a coward during the fight, had hidden behind the mission wall while others fought, had grabbed the ransom money and tried to flee until Rose physically stopped him, and now he stood diminished and irrelevant, all moral authority stripped away by his actions. Rose refused to leave Beatrice's side. "I am staying with my sister until she decides what she wants," Rose said with steel in her voice, "and if what she wants is to ride away with an outlaw, then I will help her pack." Beatrice tended Cole's wound with practiced hands that knew exactly how deep the bullet had gone and what needed to be done, and their intimacy was obvious to everyone watching, obvious in the way he trusted her touch and she anticipated his pain, obvious in how they moved together, like partners who had been working side by side for years rather than weeks. Cole, weakened from blood loss, gripped her hand and said what he thought was the right thing. "You should go home. Forget the outlaw who kidnapped you. Live the life you were meant to live." Beatrice's response was fierce enough to silence the entire mission courtyard. "You did not kidnap me," she said. "You saved me from a life of being invisible and worthless. You saw me when no one else could be bothered to look, and now I'm choosing you back. I am choosing this life over that one. I am choosing risk and danger and love over safety and respectability and slow death by invisibility. So you can accept my choice or you can break my heart, but you cannot make me go home." Father recovered his bluster once the immediate danger had passed, drew himself up with the false authority of a man who had never been genuinely tested, and demanded that Beatrice return home immediately. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he had used throughout her childhood. "You cannot possibly think to stay with this criminal, with this outlaw who kidnapped you. You will come home now, and we will never speak of this shameful episode again." Beatrice stood tall for perhaps the first time in her father's presence, stood with shoulders back and chin lifted, and spoke words that had been building in her chest for 28 years. "This criminal treated me better in 3 weeks than you did in 28 years, she said, her voice carrying across the mission courtyard with clarity that made everyone stop and listen. "He sees me and values me and protects me. He looks at me like I matter. And what did you ever do, Father, except tolerate my existence, except resent every resource I consumed and every space I occupied?" Father's face reddened and he sputtered. "I fed you and housed you and clothed you, gave you everything a daughter could need." "You resented every bite I ate," Beatrice interrupted. "Resented every dress you had to buy in a larger size. Resented every day I was not Rose. Every moment I failed to be the daughter you wanted, and I am done apologizing for existing, done being the disappointing daughter who should be grateful for the bare minimum of care, done pretending that your grudging tolerance was the same thing as love." Father drew himself up and played his final card with the confidence of a man who had never had it challenged. "Then you leave me no choice. If you stay with this criminal, I will disown you entirely. You will inherit nothing. You will have no claim on the family name or resources. Is that really what you want?" Beatrice laughed, and the sound was sharp and free and utterly without fear. "You cannot disinherit someone who is never going to inherit anything," she said. "Rose gets everything. She always has, and I was always going to be the spinster dependent, or the unwanted wife passed to whoever would take me. So your threats mean nothing, because you are only threatening to withhold what you never intended to give." Rose stepped forward and linked her arm through Beatrice's. "If she is disowned, then so am I," Rose said clearly. "I will not accept inheritance built on rejecting my sister. I will not benefit from your cruelty any longer." Father looked between his two daughters and seemed to shrink, seemed to realize that his power had been entirely dependent on their compliance, and that compliance had just ended, and Marshal Thornton watched it all with the expression of a man recognizing courage when he saw it, recognizing that sometimes the bravest act was claiming your own worth against those who had spent years denying it. Father rode off alone eventually, bitter and small and stripped of the authority he had wielded through fear and obligation, and Beatrice watched him go without regret or sorrow, watched the man who had never been a real father disappear into the desert heat like the mirage he had always been. Cole pulled Beatrice aside once the immediate chaos had settled, and his wound was bandaged, led her behind the mission wall where they could speak privately, and his face was grave despite the pain medication that should have dulled more than just his physical hurt. "You cannot stay with me," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control. "I am hunted, broke, have nothing but a horse and a gun and the clothes on my back. I cannot offer you anything resembling the life you deserve." Beatrice looked at him steadily and asked a question that cut through his protests. Did I ask what you have? Did I request an accounting of your assets or your prospects? Did I say anything about what I expect you to provide? You should ask, Cole insisted. You should demand stability and safety and respect, should expect the things any woman deserves from the man who wants her. I deserve to choose, Beatrice interrupted, and her voice carried absolute conviction. All my life others chose for me. Father chose I was not worth investing in. Society chose I was not worth courting because of my size. Stepmother chose I was the burden daughter. Everyone decided what I was worth without ever asking me, but you were the first person to let me choose myself, to treat my choices as valid and important. So I am choosing you. Cole Branson, I am choosing this life over that one. I am choosing love and danger and uncertainty over safety and respectability and slow death by invisibility. And the only question that matters is whether you will have me. Cole pulled her close despite his injury, wrapped his good arm around her and buried his face in her hair and spoke words he had been holding back for weeks. Have you, he said, his voice breaking, Beatrice, I loved you the moment you stepped in front of that gun for your sister, bravest thing I had ever seen. And every day since you have proven you're stronger and smarter and better than anyone I have known, you saved Riley's life, you fought Frank, you shot a man to protect us. You have courage I can only aspire to, and if anyone is unworthy here, it is me. Then we will be unworthy together, Beatrice said, and kissed him with all the passion and certainty she had been suppressing. Kissed him like a promise and a claim and a declaration that she was choosing this man and this future, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. Evening stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and from a distance Marshal Thornton and Rose watched the couple embrace, and both were smiling. The Marshal because he recognized love that was worth protecting even when it complicated his duty, and Rose because her sister had finally chosen herself after a lifetime of being chosen last by everyone else. Marshal Thornton found them the next morning as dawn was painting the mission walls gold, and his face held news that would change everything, though Cole could not yet know it. I sent telegrams about Miguel after our conversation yesterday, the Marshal said without preamble, reached out to contacts in 3 territories and received confirmation that you were framed, found witnesses who saw Miguel plant evidence and heard him bragging about it in a saloon 2 months after the robbery, found the banker who was paid to identify you from a photograph Miguel provided. Cole felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 years, felt vindication surge through him even as the Marshal continued. I cannot clear you entirely, the Marshal said honestly. You did commit crimes after being framed, you stole and threatened and lived outside the law regardless of what drove you to it, but I can give you something that might matter more than a pardon. He produced papers from his saddlebag, legal documents with official seals, and handed them to Cole with the careful ceremony of a man bestowing something precious. Land deed for a small ranch in New Mexico territory, the Marshal explained, confiscated from an actual criminal who will not be needing it, given that he was hanged last month. 30 acres with water rights and a cabin needs work, but it is legal and far enough from Arizona that you could start over if you were smart about it. Cole stared at the papers like they might disappear if he looked away, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to comprehend what was being offered. Why would you do this? He asked. What do you gain from helping an outlaw escape justice? The Marshal's response was simple and profound. Because justice is not just punishing wrong, he said. Sometimes it is enabling right. Sometimes it is giving good people who made bad choices a chance to prove they are more than their worst day. Miss Beatrice proved you are redeemable, and I am choosing to believe her. So prove me right about giving you this chance. He added a warning because mercy did, not mean naivete. Miguel is still out there, the Marshal said, and he will come for you eventually. Men like him do not forget or forgive, so be ready, build your life, but keep your gun close. Rose approached then with her own offering, pressed a small leather pouch into Beatrice's hands and spoke quickly before emotion could overwhelm her. I sold my engagement ring, Rose said. Henry Peterson turned out to be cruel, struck his horse in anger, and I knew if he would do that he would eventually strike me. So I am relieved to end it, and this money is my contribution, for your new start, wedding present from both of us. The 2 sisters embraced then with roles entirely reversed, Rose now supporting Beatrice instead of the other way around, and in the morning light with mercy extended and future suddenly possible. Cole felt hope dawn for the first time since Miguel had destroyed his previous life. Riley sat in the mission courtyard with his wounded shoulder bandaged and his face showing the pallor of blood loss, but his eyes were clear and focused as Cole approached with the leather pouch that held Riley's share of the ransom money. more than the man had probably ever possessed at one time. "You do not owe me anything," Cole said, offering the money. "Take your share and ride to Mexico, live well, find a cantina near the ocean and drink tequila until you forget you ever knew an outlaw named Cole Branson." Riley took the pouch and weighed it in his hand, and for a long moment everyone thought he would accept the offer and disappear, but then he set the money down and looked at Cole with something approaching affection. "Boss, I rode with you because you paid," Riley said. "Rode with you because work was scarce and you seemed less likely to get me killed than other options. But I am staying because of who you have become, because she changed you," and he gestured to where Beatrice stood watching. "Made you remember there is more to life than surviving day to day. Made you remember what it means to build instead of just take, and I want to be part of whatever you are building." He continued before Cole could protest. "You will need help with that ranch, need someone who knows the difference between a fence post and a roof beam, and I am handy with hammer and saw when not being shot, have built things before and would not mind building something that lasts, instead of just robbing things that belong to others." Beatrice moved closer and added her own invitation with words that made Riley's eyes shine suspiciously bright. "You are family now, Riley," she said. "If you want to be, family is not just blood, but choice, and we are choosing you the same way you are choosing us." Riley, rough outlaw who had lived by violence and expedience for longer than he cared to remember, felt tears threaten and had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Never had family," he admitted. "Had people I worked with, and people I feared, and people I robbed, but never had anyone. Chose me for anything other than what I could do for them, and I would not mind having family if you will have me despite all my rough edges and poor choices." The three of them stood together in the courtyard shade, three people who had been rejected or betrayed by previous lives, who had found each other through circumstances that should have torn them apart but instead had forged bonds stronger than blood or history, and they understood without needing to speak it that they were forming something new here. We're creating family not from obligation but from choice, from mutual respect and shared survival, and the understanding that sometimes the people who matter most are the ones you choose rather than the ones you are born to. And as they prepared to leave the mission and ride toward New Mexico and whatever future awaited them there, they did so knowing that whatever challenges came they would face together as the found family they had become. Cole and Beatrice and Riley travelled 3 weeks across territories toward the New Mexico land, and the journey was hard with long days in the saddle and short nights of restless sleep on hard ground. But it was also hopeful in ways that none of them had experienced before, hopeful because they were travelling towards something they were building rather than away from something they were fleeing. Beatrice learned to ride better with Cole's patient instruction, learned to shoot accurately at targets he set up during rest stops, learned to navigate by stars on clear nights when he pointed out constellations and explained how to find direction even when the sun had long since set. And she absorbed every lesson with the hunger of someone who had spent too long being told she was incapable of learning such skills. Cole learned to trust again, learned to plan for a future that extended beyond the next day or week, learned to think in terms of seasons and years rather than immediate survival. And the transformation was visible in the way his shoulders gradually lost their defensive hunch, the way his eyes scanned horizons with anticipation rather than just wariness, the way he spoke about spring planting and fall harvest as if he truly believed he would live to see them. Riley provided humour when the journey grew tedious and protection when they passed through territories where strangers were viewed with suspicion, and his presence allowed Cole and Beatrice moments of privacy that would have been impossible if they travelled as only a pair, moments where they could talk without being overheard or simply ride side by side in companionable silence. They talked endlessly about ranch plans, about what to build first and what could wait, about what stock to raise and how to make the land profitable, about water management and crop rotation and 100 other practical details. And Beatrice's practical mind contributed business sense that neither man possessed, her years of managing household budgets and stretching, resources translating perfectly to the economics of a small ranch. One night camped under stars so thick they looked like spilled sugar waru across black cloth, Cole asked the question that had been haunting him since they left Arizona. "Do you regret it?" he said quietly. "Choosing this instead of a safe life in Tucson, choosing hardship and uncertainty instead of comfort and respectability." Beatrice looked at their modest camp with its small fire and simple bedrolls, looked at Riley sleeping nearby with his rifle within easy reach, looked at Cole's face illuminated by firelight and stars, and her answer came without hesitation. "I regret nothing," she said. "For the first time in my life I am alive instead of just existing. I am seen instead of invisible. I am choosing instead of being chosen for, and that is worth every hardship we might face. They made love under those stars that night after Riley had fallen into snoring sleep and the fire had burned to embers, made love with the awkward tenderness of Beatrice's first time, and the reverent care of Cole's first time since Elizabeth, that meant anything beyond physical release. And afterward they lay wrapped together in blankets and watched the sky wheel overhead and understood that they had crossed some threshold that could never be uncrossed, had committed to each other in ways that went beyond words or even the future marriage ceremony they planned. And the intimacy of it, the trust required to be so vulnerable with another person, felt like the final shedding of their old lives and the full embrace of whatever new life they were building together in the New Mexico territory that waited at the end of this long journey. The New Mexico land was rough when they arrived, the small cabin barely standing with half its roof caved in and walls that had holes large enough for coyotes to enter. No barn at all, just the rotted remains of a corral, fields overgrown with sage and mesquite that would need clearing before any planting could happen, but it had water from a spring that ran clear and cold year-round, had soil that was sandy but workable, had potential that all three of them could see even through the neglect and damage. They worked for months building and repairing, worked through the last heat of summer and into the cooling days of autumn, and Beatrice proved invaluable in ways that surprised even Cole, who had already learned not to underestimate her strength which had never been weakness, despite a lifetime of assumptions allowing her to lift and carry and dig alongside the men, her household skills creating comfort in the evenings as when they were exhausted and needed hot food and clean clothes, and the psychological restoration that comes from order in chaos, her mind-solving problems that neither Cole nor Riley had the education or experience to address. Cole and Riley repaired the cabin first because shelter mattered more than anything else as winter approached, then constructed a barn using lumber they hauled from the nearest town 3 days away, then planned irrigation channels that would bring spring water to fields they intended to plant come spring, and the physical labour was back-breaking but satisfying in ways that theft and running had never been. Satisfying because they were building instead of destroying, creating instead of taking. They pooled remaining ransom money with Riley's savings and the money from Rose's ring to buy starter stock, 6 pregnant cows and a bull, 12 chickens and a rooster, 2 horses beyond the ones they rode, and the purchases represented faith in a future that extended beyond immediate survival, represented commitment to staying and growing rather than just passing through. Neighbours were few this far from established towns, but the ones who existed accepted them without judgment or excessive curiosity. The frontier being full of people reinventing themselves and understanding that questions about the past were impolite and often dangerous. And gradually Cole and Beatrice and Riley became known simply as the folks at the old Henderson place who were fixing it up nice. One evening, as the first snow dusted the mountains in the distance, Cole found Beatrice sitting on the porch they had rebuilt, crying quietly into her hands, and his heart clenched with fear that she regretted everything, that the hardship had finally broken through her determination. "What is wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt? Are you unhappy? Do you want to leave?" "Nothing is wrong," Beatrice said through her tears. "I am happy, truly happy for the first time in my life, and it frightens me because I keep waiting for it to be taken away. Keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream." Cole pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried, held her until the tears stopped and the shaking ceased, and his voice when he spoke was firm with absolute conviction. "Get used to it," he said. "This is forever now, this happiness, this home, this life we are building together. It is not going away, and neither am I." Ranch was thriving 1 year after they arrived. The cabin expanded with a second room for the baby that was growing in Beatrice's belly, her body round with pregnancy but glowing with health and happiness in ways that made Cole's chest tight with gratitude every time he looked at her. And Riley had built his own small house on the eastern edge of their property, and was courting a widow from town named Sarah who made him laugh and blush like a boy half his age. Life had settled into peaceful rhythms of work and rest and the quiet satisfaction of building something that would last. And Cole had almost stopped checking the horizon for threats, had almost convinced himself that the past was truly buried when Miguel appeared at their property line with 2 remaining men, all 3 looking desperate and broke and hunted in ways that suggested the year had not been kind to them. "You took everything from me, Cole," Miguel shouted across the yard. "My reputation when you told the truth about the bank job, my money when I had to keep running and bribing lawmen, my future, and now I will take everything from you, starting with that fat woman you somehow convinced to love you." Cole felt his blood turn to ice as Miguel's gun swung toward Beatrice, who had emerged from the cabin, at the sound of voices, felt the impossible choice settle over him like a shroud. He could let Miguel shoot him, and hope that satisfied the man's revenge and Beatrice would be spared, or he could fight and risk her in the crossfire, and neither option was acceptable when she carried their child beneath her heart. Beatrice made the choice for him, stepped forward, just as she had that first day at her father's ranch, but this time she held a rifle in steady hands and her voice carried across the yard with absolute authority. "He is not alone anymore," she told Miguel. "None of us are. This is what you never understood about building instead of destroying, or about creating family instead of using people." Riley emerged from the barn with his rifle raised, and then 3 neighbors who had seen Miguel's approach and recognized trouble appeared from various positions around the property, all armed and all ready to defend the people who had become part of their community, and Miguel's face went pale as he realized he was outgunned and outmanned and had made a fatal miscalculation. Marshal Thornton rode up the road at a gallop, his badge catching the evening light. "Been tracking you, Miguel," the marshal said. "It is over. You are under arrest for the Tucson bank robbery and about 6 other crimes I have documented since." And Miguel, cornered and desperate, made one last attempt to shoot Cole, but Beatrice fired first. Her shot so perfect it knocked the gun from Miguel's hand without touching flesh, the kind of shot that only came from months of practice and a teacher who had believed she could learn anything she set her mind to. Miguel was arrested and dragged away, still cursing. Cole's name was finally cleared of all charges, and as evening light painted everything gold, Beatrice stood surrounded by the family and community she had helped build, the woman who had once thought herself worthless having just saved everyone. Her transformation from invisible burden to essential hero complete in ways that made even the sunset seem inadequate to mark the moment's significance.